Great. Okay. So firstly, to just introduce myself, my name's Ruth Powley. I'm a deputy head teacher at Wilmslow High School. It's a big school. We have around 2,000 students, and we are very committed to the concept of powerful teaching, but also the professional learning school, and working together collaboratively within our own community, but also working collaboratively with other schools. Like all other senior leaders at the minute, I spend most of my day doing logistical things and managing things and checking that we've got remote learning ready and checking that students have got digital devices, etc. So I'm very aware that there's a huge amount of organisation that we're all doing at the minute, and it is very tiring. But I didn't want to talk today about the hard work and the tiring bits, and I wanted to talk today about the opportunity. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. So I've deliberately called these sessions, I've deliberately focused on the sense of powerful teaching and powerful learning, because I actually think that that's really important. I think this is a moment for empowerment. It's a moment in education where, in a way, we've never been so free of Ofsted. And I know they're planning their autumn visits, but nevertheless, I think it is a moment of freedom for us. It's a moment of freedom for us from Progress 8. It's a moment where I think we need to be creative, because I don't think that actually there are top-down solutions to the issues that we're facing at the moment. And it's a moment when I think it's really important that our teachers and our students feel successful. And so what I want to talk about this afternoon is actually how we achieve this concept of powerful teaching, and then I'll move on into later sessions to look at powerful learning and powerful learners. So if I could have the next slide, please. If we could just go back one. I think that powerful learning and teaching really matter at the minute, because actually we're facing barriers. We're facing barriers in the classroom with our from the front teaching. We're needing to keep 2 meters distant from students, and that affects the teaching that we're actually able to do. And if our students are not in, and certainly for us today, we have got a number of students who are not able to be in school with us, we're actually having to educate students remotely. And again, that puts barriers up to our teaching and our learning, and therefore the power of our teaching is all the more important. So if I could have the next slide, please. For those of you who have listened to me before, I've referred before to my book, which was actually written a couple of years ago, before any of us knew that this was going to happen. And it talks about powerful pedagogy. And the concept behind powerful pedagogy is that for too long in education, we have been, I am going to use the word victims, we have been victims to whoever would come along and whoever would give us the latest silver bullet, or the latest idea, or the latest fashionable thing that everybody was doing. And actually, our independence as professionals and our autonomy and our empowerment as the people who've chosen to go into teaching, and the people who spend our lives in the classroom or on the corridors or making good teaching happen, it's really important that we are able to make powerful choices about the teaching and learning that is happening in our schools. And those powerful choices do need to be informed by pedagogy, because otherwise we might not be doing the most efficient thing, we might not be doing the most effective thing. And this year is a moment for us to be good at teaching, because this is a year where teaching is hard, and it's harder than it would normally be, and there are barriers that wouldn't normally be there. So the better we are at teaching, the more quickly we can teach effectively, the more successful we will feel, the more successful our students will be. So if I could move on to the next slide. In this presentation, there's going to be a mixture of the pedagogy and the theory, if you like, and then also the practice and what that actually looks like in terms of working with your subject leaders. What we've done is taken these ideas of powerful pedagogy and we've broken them down for four ways, twice, if you like. The first way that we've broken them down is to have our four components of the lesson and to make it very, very simple and to talk about these four areas of good learning and keep it simple. But what we've then done is actually thought about the four ways, and I apologise because you can only see three of them on this slide, but I will come back to this as I go through the slides. We're thinking about the four ways that actually we're having to engage with our students at the moment. One of those ways we're not able to do at all in Wilmslow at present, which is that normal proximate teaching where you're actually able to get close to a student, you're actually able to look at their work with them, you're able to be within that 1 meter's distance. What we're doing a lot of at the moment is what we call teaching from the front. And teaching from the front looks like certain types of delivery that, of course, we're all getting to grips with. And I will talk more as I go through the slides about some of the things that have worked for us there. And then we've got two types of other learning that we are using. We've obviously got our live lessons using Zoom or Teams. And then, of course, we've got our remote learning and, for example, our narrated PowerPoints, etc., which are not being delivered live. And so the grid that you can see is our way of actually getting our subject leads to think about the components of good learning and how we're able to do them in any setting. And I'll show you a filled in version of this grid a bit later on in the presentation. The other thing that we've really emphasised is oracy, because actually during the period of lockdown, oracy suffered. And even now, oracy is suffering. Speaking to students, either wearing a mask or them wearing a mask, does not help oracy. It does not help communication. From the front teaching, where students have to articulate more loudly and clearly, again, demands a high quality of oracy. So this is a moment where oracy should be front and centre as part of what we're doing. And that's why we've included it in the grid. And just to mention, we deliberately, when we looked at our four areas of teaching, we deliberately stepped away from formative assessment. And the reason that we stepped away from formative assessment is because it's become so contested now. And various people wanting to talk instead about responsive teaching, for example. And we just wanted to keep it very simple. And that's why we chose to go with the checking for understanding. So if I could move on to the next slide. So what I'm trying to give you here is the sense of the building blocks that we've been using in order to add to the power of our teaching. And the first building block that I'm going to mention is the concept of expertise. One of the things that we've deliberately talked about with our teachers is the fact that teaching is complex. If we try and simplify it too much, if we try and make it about these silver bullets that will magically work and these quick fixes or easy fixes, we're actually dumbing down an activity which is a highly complex activity. And is the reason that we're professionals, because it's not easy to teach effectively. And in the circumstances that we currently find ourselves in, it's actually even harder. And so we're not shying away from the fact that effective teaching demands expertise. And ideally, it actually demands understanding of fairly complex ideas. And so, for example, the importance of cognitive load theory and why you structure a curriculum sequence in the way that you do. And what we're trying to point out to our staff is that by having this complex understanding and by developing this expertise, and knowing why what works, it actually allows people to save time by making more sensible choices about what it is we're actually teaching. So we've put a great deal into our inset and training for staff. At the start of the year, we deliberately took 3 days of inset in order to make sure that our teachers were really familiar with good quality pedagogy to make those effective choices using the framework that I've just shown you. So we could move on to the next slide, please. So again, we are back to the grid that I showed you, and this is what we've done. This model is the model that we've used across all of our subject leads, so that they have been thinking, and they've been thinking since, I would say, June, about these 4 different scenarios and what choices they're making in each of the different scenarios. And at the minute, as a school, I'm sure you'll be the same, we're operating across 3 of them. The only one that we're not able to run at the moment is the in-school proximate teaching, which obviously will hopefully come back over the course of the year. But our staff are having to get used to that flexibility of making choices that will work across 3 scenarios. And so we find this a helpful planning matrix. If I could have the next slide. And so some of the things that we are thinking about in that are, we've tried to go back to the concept of how people learn. Powerful teaching is only powerful teaching if it causes powerful learning. If there's no powerful learning, then it's actually not powerful teaching. And we've linked this into the importance of the curriculum sequence. And we've gone back to what a curriculum sequence is supposed to be doing. And this is all the more important in from the front teaching, because of course what we're trying to get our students to do is to build that effective map or schemata. It's up to you. We're using both, and we are talking about schemata with our students, but equally, you know, we are sometimes using the word maps as well to talk about that sense of what students are aiming to build. And this is actually really important, because if our students are, if we're simply training students to pass exams, then the problem with that is that there's nothing left after that in terms of that rich body of knowledge that a student should actually be able to take with them. And one of the things, of course, that we you know, believe in whole education is that importance of empowered students and autonomous students. And so there is a sense in which if we give our students any less than fluency, we're selling them short, because we're just giving them a half thing. And, you know, I've sometimes used here the concept of the driving test here. Nobody talks about being able to half drive. You can either drive or you can't drive. And if you can't drive, you just can't drive. It doesn't matter if you can 50% not drive or 25% not drive. And so fluency, I think, is something that students deserve. And so we're going back to that very simple way of looking at our teaching. And if it isn't building fluency, it needs to be better. And that's our aim, is to think, how do we actually get that fluency? But I'll come back to this one as I talk through the slides. And you'll see that we are really focusing on, in our teaching, the things that need to be going on in students' heads. And we've deliberately, we're making a lot of fuss of the word attention this year, because if we go back to our different scenarios, attention is a really good word to be focusing teachers and students on. We all know, and you may be experiencing it now, we all know it is not easy to pay attention in a live session. It is not easy to pay attention watching something on a video. It can be harder to attract attention in front of from the front teaching. So the importance of attention at this moment of time in teaching is something that we should really be focusing on. And then, of course, other aspects like encoding are all harder when it's harder for us to actually see students' books and interact with them. And therefore, the way students are looking after and organising their work becomes more important. So if I could have the next slide, please. If you're not familiar with it, I would recommend Tom Sherrington's book on Rosenshine's principles. So Rosenshine produced his principles of instruction. They're very simple, they're very straightforward. The paper that Rosenshine wrote is actually extremely accessible. So it isn't that Tom Sherrington has taken very difficult, complex processes and made them easier. What he has done is shined a light on the principles which are clear and straightforward and very much about effective instruction. And this comes back to what we've said already about fluency. Not every student will have the same body of knowledge. For some students, it will be a smaller body of knowledge. For some students, it will be much bigger and much deeper. But it's really important that we're committed that every student should be gaining fluency of something. Because if we're not giving them fluency, if there's nothing they can actually do well, then what is it we're actually doing with them and how are we actually helping them? And what's good about Rosenshine's principles are that they look at how the learning process develops and how the novice learner needs to become an expert learner, and any student can become an expert learner in something. And that might be something, as I've said, relatively small, relatively shallow, but that is still doable. And it requires certain things to be going on in the lesson, wherever that lesson is taking place. So I would advise Rosenshine's book. It's very thin, it's an easy read, and it's very, very practical. And the techniques in it fit very well with from the front teaching or putting together that effective video lesson or that effective live lesson. And I will come back to the principle of 80% practice because that is actually a very important one. So if I could move on to the next slide. Cognitive load theory is helpful because it helps us to think about where an activity needs to take place. So it's not necessarily thinking about what you teach so much as the order that it takes place, and particularly that scaffolding and that guiding of practice in the initial stages. And so if I move on to the next slide, there are three elements of the moving from the novice to the expert learner. And it's worth actually thinking with staff about what type of activity should be happening in each of those stages. And so what you can see here is a screenshot from, we use Firefly and we talk about how we teach, and we have that on Firefly so our staff can see that. So if I could move on to the first, again, the next slide. So if you want to do the reading, Renkel and Atkinson is a paper that talks about the order of learning in order to go from a novice learner to an expert learner. It's not a long paper, and it is worth reading if you like reading research papers, but fine if not. You know, the thinking about it is in this PowerPoint, but you might find it interesting. And I certainly think that they write as well about this as anybody. So if I could move on to the next slide. So Renkel and Atkinson talk about these three phases, and these three phases are not about the learner. So the three phases are not labeling a learner, and that's really important because the principle here is not to say that there are fluent learners and there are learners who are not fluent. It's to talk about the learning. And I think that labelling is crucial in powerful teaching, because in powerful teaching, we shouldn't be labelling learners. Because the problem with labelling learners is there's an automatic cop-out in it, because if we are labelling a learner as a fluent learner, then we're writing off everybody else as saying, do you know what, fluency doesn't matter for you, you're never going to achieve it. And actually, we do need to be, instead of labelling our learners, we need to be labelling the learning to say it's a journey. It's a journey to fluency. Every child is entitled to go on that journey to fluency. And the fluency they end up with may be different. There may be different bodies of knowledge. That's fine. But it's important that every child is entitled to that fluency. So on that journey of learning, which is what powerful teaching needs to achieve, the early phase is the one that any student needs to go through, no matter how intelligent, where actually they are acquiring their initial knowledge. And this is the stage where it's really important that the teacher is heavily involved, and heavily involved through modelling, heavily involved through scaffolding, heavily involved through closely guided practice. And so those are the things that do need to be happening at this stage. It needs to be very, very, very hands-on. And one of the great things about teaching over the last few years is we've moved away from the fashion by which it was expected that actually you wouldn't have this very hands-on, very instructional phase of teaching. So this is important, and the more that a learner struggles with learning, the longer, the deeper, the more guided this phase needs to be. If we then move on to the next slide, the intermediate phase then is this fading phase, and 80% is the figure that Rosenshine identified for this fading stage, where the learner is able to start becoming more independent. And the example we're using with our students and our parents is the sense of starting to take the stabilizers off. You can't ride a bike if you're still riding it with stabilizers on, and learning is like that. We need to be moving students on from the stabilizers we are providing to actually being able to do something independently. I think that 80% is really important, because if a student is not 80% successful at something before moving on, then actually they're not going to become fluent at that thing. Now, this isn't the same as a test, and this is why this is about learning rather than necessarily preparing to pass an exam. This is about gaining the sort of building blocks or chunks of knowledge that will actually help students to know things and help them to learn things. And this is the stage, and actually the early phase of the stage is where feedback is really, really important. And so in a from the front classroom, or a live lesson or a remote video, the key question will be, how are you able to check for understanding? And what we found during lockdown was that the part of our learning that we needed to focus on the most as teachers was making sure we had enough checking for understanding, because we weren't doing that enough. And so the various, that's our focus at the minute. How can we do more of that? So if I could have the next slide, which is the final phase then of learning. And this is the phase where the student should be becoming quicker, more accurate, more automatic. And again, there are certain activities that are not good at this stage. It's not actually good to be giving immediate feedback at this stage, because students should be able to struggle and reflect more on what they're doing and self-correct a bit more than they'd be able to do in an early phase. So the old-fashioned concept that we mark books every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks isn't actually related to this concept of where feedback needs to happen. Feedback needs to happen more in the early phases. It needs to happen less and in a more delayed way in the later phases of learning. So it's actually thinking about the learning that needs to occur, and therefore the teaching choices that need to be made in order to allow this learning to occur. And too much guided scaffolding and modelling at this stage can actually be harmful. So again, it's about making different choices for learners as they're moving through the learning. And how do we know that they're moving through the learning? By that assessment and that checking for understanding, which allows us to see, have they reached the crucial 80% success at something, which means that it can be moved on from. So if we could have the next slide, please. So this is one of the things we're asking ourselves at the minute in our teaching. What does 80% look like? Because this isn't about a test result. This is about that sense of being 80% good at something, and challenging our teaching. Because if we're not teaching every student to be 80% good at something, what are we teaching them? And this, to me, is where it's quite important to go back to the concept of schemata and maps of knowledge. Because if any of us think of something that we don't know very well, in a way, there's a limited point to it. It isn't connected to anything. It isn't helping us. It isn't knowledge that we can use. So I think that by focusing on fluency and by focusing on effective, powerful teaching helps students to be successful at something. And therefore we start from that end result, if you like, and think, well, what teaching choices do we need to make that mean that our students will be able to do this thing? And that's why, in a sense, some assessment can be quite disappointing, because I do understand why in a maths GCSE, for example, it might be that we make the decision that students can achieve a grade with, for example, 25%, but we're not, in the rest of our teaching, we're not just teaching students to pass exams, we're actually teaching them to know things. And if we're teaching them to know things, then actually we need to make sure that our success rates are far higher. And so by thinking like this, it raises all sorts of issues of how do you assess? And what does effective assessment look like to actually ensure that students do know things and can build effective and permanent learning? So if I could have the next slide, please. So this just gives you a screenshot of how we teach at Wilmslow and the way that we have organised this information for our teachers. And so we've deliberately used the framework of intent and implementation. So our intent is the understanding of the pedagogy, and we haven't shied away from that with our teachers or our learning support assistants. We've expected them to know about the pedagogy. We've been clear that we're not just giving them simple silver bullets, do you know what, simple checklist, because teaching is not a simple activity, it's a complex activity. So the intent section is at a level that you would find in any school that was thinking about the pedagogy of teaching, whereas the implementation is how we do it at Wilmslow and how that fits with our planning and the way that we sort of structure our thinking. We've really focused, and again, this fits with the teaching across the 4 scenarios. We're really focusing on routines, because we actually think that this is a time to be building effective routines for students and teachers. And then we've tried to provide lots of ideas and lots of strategies, and I'll be sharing some of those with you shortly. And then I don't know if people can see it on the screen, but we've got a button that's called How We Teach Across Different Scenarios. And that's, you know, every week we're working on building that with more ideas about different strategies, because at this current time, we are operating as a school across 3 different scenarios and are likely to be doing that for some time to come. If I could have the next slide, please. So I've shared with you here the Loom presentations that I actually did for our staff with the amount of time of them, just as to give you some sense of what we talk to staff about in terms of effective learning, effective teaching. We asked all our staff to watch these videos because we wanted to have a shared language. Because one of the things that can sometimes happen in a school is that people did their training at different times, they may have read different books, they may have given more or less time to thinking about their pedagogy and thinking about their professional learning. And you can therefore get people a little bit, if you imagine a cliff with fossils in it and different stratified with different layers of where people are in their professional learning journey. And we really wanted to be talking a similar language, not in a corporate way. That's really, really important. It wasn't about trying to be corporate. It wasn't about trying to be too samey, but it was about a shared understanding. And it was about that shared sense of what do we mean by fluency? Do we all understand the concept of cognitive load theory? Do we all understand, you know, the sort of the sense of the 80%? And so this was our way of trying in a big school, in a very big school with a lot of staff, trying to build that sense of coherence. If I could have the next slide, please. And also, I mean, these couple of slides that I'll share with you here just dip away, in a sense, into curriculum and being clear about the difference between curriculum and pedagogy, and the sense of curriculum as what we teach and pedagogy as the choices of how we teach it. And at the moment, we're thinking about both. We do need to think about modifying our curriculums in the current year, but actually we're thinking more about how we teach, and particularly how we teach across, at the minute, the different scenarios. If I could have the next slide. I put this in because I do think it's important, and I think it's also important at the current time, because we in our school, and I'm sure we're not the only school who have found this, have found that it is some of our more disengaged students who have disengaged the most, that gaps for our students have opened up since March. For some of our students, they've really loved being out of school, and they have effective digital devices, they have effective digital fluency, and actually they've been able to really get ahead. Whereas for others of our students, without the structure of school, without the routine, they have disengaged. And we feel that they've wanted to engage with us, but they haven't necessarily known how, they haven't necessarily had the digital fluency. And so I think it's really important that sense of powerful knowledge. This is a year where we need to be giving those students back that sense of powerful knowledge. And in a way, this for me, it's a bit of a random slide. I stuck it in there because I do think it's one that's important to think about, but it comes back to the concept of 80%. And it comes back to the concept that every student deserves fluency, and every student deserves to know something well, and not just what they knew anyway before we taught it them. You know, not just the knowledge of the relevant to them, but actually the knowledge that only we can give them, and the knowledge that without us, they would never have. And I think that sense of curriculum as a mechanism for social justice is a really important one, and it's a particularly important one for this year. And so that's why I've sort of thrown this slide in. If I could have the next slide, please. And on that similar sort of topic, it's worth thinking this year about the concept of fragile knowledge. This is a year where students will have gaps, and that's not to talk about catch-up curriculums or recovery curriculums, etc. It's just to think about the fact that where students are missing knowledge, we need to think carefully. We need, if we're going to have that concept of 80% success, we need to think carefully about our curriculum for this year to make sure that students can do that, and to make sure that actually where they are missing knowledge, actually that's something that we're able to sort of help them to build up. So again, that's why I've just sort of thrown this slide in there as one that might provoke interest. Moving on then. If we therefore get into the practical, I've talked sort of about the pedagogy, one of the interesting things, it comes back to empowerment. One of the moments of opportunity for us at this current time is that for some of our students, teaching has been very much, I'm going to use an 80s sort of analogy here, which depending on your age will resonate or not. If you think about the time when a phone was rooted in a location, and it might be that your phone was, for example, at the bottom of the stairs in the hallway, and that's where your phone was, and you were rooted there. And if you wanted to be on the phone, you were rooted to that spot. And so therefore you would spend many a cold evening in the hall on the phone because that was where it lived. And for some of our students, despite actually a lot of technology in the world, teaching has been rooted in the classroom and learning has been rooted in the classroom, and that's where it happens. And what's been fascinating is for some of our students, it's been very hard for them to actually get rid of that sense of rootedness. We've had students where, because the classroom isn't there, they feel that the learning isn't there. And that's the thing, that really this is our opportunity to empower our students, that sense of location-free teaching, that teaching does not just have to happen in a classroom. And this is not to say that actually learning doesn't need teaching. I think that actually the point of powerful teaching is that instruction is important. It's not always fashionable, but actually powerful teaching does make a difference. Powerful explanation does make a difference. Leaving our students without that is selling them short of something. But we perhaps need to take the opportunity with the different scenarios we've got at the current time of derooting teaching from, do you know what, it has to happen like this, it has to happen in a classroom. And the whole point of the flexible scenarios that we find ourselves in at the minute is it does give that opportunity to students and to us for how we message that, how we put that across. So if I could have the next slide. So again, back to the teaching and learning plan across the 4 scenarios. And if we move on again to the next slide, what I've therefore done here is, rather than take you through the practical strategies now, I will talk a little bit about, at a higher level about each of them, but I've given you links. And these links were, as we were looking at this over the summer, and as we were thinking, do you know what is really helpful about each of these, they're links that you can go in and click on. If you don't like them, that's absolutely fine. But it's that sense of ideas and that sense of, again, blogs and writing that can be easily shared and just helps to generate thinking. And so when it comes to explanation and modelling, as I'm sure with a lot of schools, what we've really focused on is the visualiser, because there are certain bits of kit at the minute that are helpful. And with from the front, because modelling is so important, and giving that sense of what a student is aiming to achieve in a from the front setting of teaching, those visualisers we are finding are very useful. And so some of the links that I've got here are people talking about how they're using visualisers or talking about how they're using modelling. And what we've done with these links is we've actually put them in the grid ready for teachers. So in that grid where a teacher is making decisions about what am I going to use in which scenario, they've actually got some good practice links in each of the scenarios for them to make a choice about it. So that's our thinking about the explanation and modelling. If we move on to the next slide, I've deliberately picked out dual coding because dual coding is useful across any of the scenarios, because it's about how you produce a resource that fits better with students' cognitive load. Now, I'm not going to try and be better than the learning scientists at explaining this, but it is worth looking at, and we will be using our inset in November to train our staff in the use of dual coding, to be putting together resources, because it's thinking about where do you use writing, where do you use an image, how do you put writing and image together, or how do you put, if you're making a video, how do you use dual coding in creating a video? And this is all worth thinking about, because the quality of our resources this year is going to matter, and creating high quality resources is worth doing. So dual coding very much fits with that. And again, the learning scientists make it pretty straightforward. So from the point of view of staff who are short of time, these are easy links for people to just take a quick look at and get it properly, but without having to spend too much time on it. If I could have the next slide. With practice, again, what you can see is a series of links here. And again, we've put them into our grid to think about the different scenarios. But the key that we focused on is that concept which fits with cognitive load theory of I do, we do, you do. And that is absolutely central to cognitive load theory in terms of instruction, because it is saying don't do it the other way round. Don't do you do first, then we'll do it, then I'll do it, because it, from a cognitive load point of view, it doesn't work as effectively, it doesn't work as quickly. And one of the things we do need to be doing this year is, where we can, we need to be quick with our teaching, not because we're rushing it, but because we're not spending time on the things that don't work quickly, and we are spending time on the things that do work quickly. Now, it's fascinating. Teacher instruction has often not been fashionable in teaching, but actually teaching instruction can be highly effective and can be very quick and is very important and provides good scaffolding for students. And so thinking about how do we provide that guided practice from the front, but also in a live lesson or in a video lesson, how do we make sure the guided practice is there, is worth thinking about, and hopefully there are strategies there that will be helpful to people. If we move on to the next slide. Again, I've already explained that we've deliberately moved away from formative assessment because it was ceasing to have a helpful meaning for people, and we've moved therefore to checking for understanding. And again, there are various practical strategies here about, for example, hinge questions and whole class feedback. We found this the hardest area to sort of, in the 4 areas of teaching and learning, we found this the hardest one to get right in a remote learning setting. And the one that, when we were able to bring students back, was the one that most required a teacher in front of a student. We're continuing to develop it. We're continuing to look at ways in which we can check for understanding, and there are ideas that our staff are having and resources that they're sharing all the time to do that. But it's really important that this element of the teaching and learning is not left out. Moving on to the next slide. And we're particularly interested in elaboration, because elaboration is the student themselves checking for understanding by talking through their learning. And so elaboration has a number of positives that make it worth development at this point in time. It's about oracy, because elaboration, you talk, and that is important for our students because they haven't been talking enough about their learning. So for that reason alone, it's worth having plenty of elaboration going on at the minute as part of powerful teaching and powerful learning. But it's also good because it can be done anywhere by a student. It doesn't require a teacher, therefore it can operate across any type of scenario. So it is very versatile, it is very flexible. And what we're trying to do with our strategies, by putting them into that grid, we can look at those strategies that you can actually use all over the place in a range of scenarios, compared to those strategies that only work in one particular scenario. If we move on to the next slide, retrieval, again, there are lots of ideas here about different ways of using retrieval, which again fit in the grid that I've shown you. And I've also picked out this book by Kate Jones, which has got lots and lots of ideas about effective retrieval strategies. And many of those strategies will work across a range of scenarios and are worth looking at for that reason. Again, it's a short book and a simple book, and so probably worth somebody in your school reading if you're not already aware of it. Next slide. So this is an example of a filled in grid and how one of our teams is using it, and they are collecting basically ideas and strategies. We are finding that Doug Lemov is very useful in terms of that from the front, more emphatic teaching, and those strategies that will work there. And so this is what our inset focused on, was our teachers thinking across each scenario and each aspect of the lesson what strategies they would be using. And so for each of our subject areas, we've got this plan of what teaching they intend to use in order to be ready for that scenario. If I could have the next slide. And so where we're up to at the minute as an organisation is again on our Firefly page, collecting those strategies and ideas for each different scenario, so that teachers are ready for if it's going to be live, or ready if we're using videos, or ready if it's a year group, the partial year group going home, and also ready for from the front, because from the front teaching is different to normal teaching, and it does require those different activities. We made sure that each of our students had, we did make sure each of our students has a mini whiteboard in order to make sure that checking for understanding is there. And because in Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, that's a bit of kit we expect the students to have, that will actually be something we can use in our live learning if we therefore need to do that. I think if you could click and see if there is another slide. And I've got a feeling, yeah, that's the last slide. So that's the end of my presentation. And so I'm ready for any questions and discussion. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you ever so much, Ruth. And if colleagues would like to, if they choose to show themselves and obviously take off their videos for any questions, that would be fantastic. I just want to start off by saying thank you for a clear and extremely comprehensive presentation, Ruth, and for being so open and honest about what you're doing in a large secondary school right here, right now, so of current relevance, and also the helpful and useful resources that you've shared, that I'm sure colleagues around the room, the virtual room, are already thinking about how they can go back and utilize those in their own settings. I know that I want to rewatch the presentation already, and you've literally finished 30 seconds ago, so I've already got several things mulling. But if I can open it up to the floor, I'm going to start off by Nicola. Where's Nicola in the room? I can't. Yeah, Nicola Cuthbert. I think you had a question for Ruth early on. Shall I unmute you, Nicola? So whilst Nicola is Nicola unmuted?
Hi, can you hear me?
You're very low, Nicola, but if you want to have a go.
It's clarification of the term schemata, please. It's something I've never come across. I'm with my colleague, and we've never come across that word before.
Okay, yeah, I think I got that clarification about the word schemata.
That's, yes.
Okay, so it's the concept of how we build a framework of knowledge. And so the best way of, well, I find one of the ways of explaining it is if you think about something you don't know very well, and I'm going to shock you now with my lack of science knowledge, because that's always one I personally use when trying to explain this one. And in my science knowledge, I haven't studied science since I did it at GCSE, nothing is really connected. I know a few random things, but they sort of float around. They don't connect to each other. And schemata is the way that you build a map of knowledge. It's what really where the sort of the idea of the knowledge organizer in a sense came from. You build the links and the connections, and that's how people learn. When we talk about the importance of prior learning, students start with a body of knowledge. It may be a smaller body of knowledge, it may be a larger body of knowledge, and we connect things to it. And it's the building of that network and the building of those connections that are what create learning. And there's lots of evidence to show the importance of reading, to building this schemata and building this prior knowledge, and the impact that prior knowledge actually has on students' vocabulary. Again, I'll use another example of that importance of prior knowledge. I'm not particularly a sports fan, and I have colleagues who talk about cricket, not a lot, to be fair to them, but they do talk about cricket. And I do not have the vocabulary. So actually, one is that the importance of that. There are studies that show that domain-specific knowledge is more important than actual attainment, because actually understanding and having that schemata, having those connections about something is something that we can really give our students. And so the schemata is that sense of the map and the connections. And I guess the challenge that we are putting down to our teachers this year is to say, if you got your students to draw their knowledge of history or geography or physics, and you got them to put it on a piece of paper, what would it look like? Is it real to them? Is it something that they actually have a sense of fluency and they know something? Or is it sort of random bits of information floating around and sort of quickly lost? And so we're trying to go back to the point of that the end result of learning for a student is not just to pass an exam and get a letter or a number. It's to actually to know something that will be of value to them, as they move forward through their life, and to know it completely and to know it well. Does that help to give you a sense?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I could guess who the cricket fan was, Ruth. That's why I was smiling in the background there. Thank you for that question, Nicola, and also for an incredibly whole education answer, Ruth. I know that you are a passionate whole education believer, but learning for the young person and for their life, I think is something that is very, very important, alongside enabling them to do exceptionally well in the academic field of exams, etc. I think we had a question from Sophia, and I think Zara might be poised to give a question as well. Hello, Zara. So Sophia, I don't know if you want to ask your question. You're unmuted now, Sophia, or I can ask it.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, hi there. Hi, Ruth. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I've really enjoyed all this consolidation of information and references. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on the difference between the formative assessment and checking for understanding trend? I'm not quite clear on that.
Okay, so what I'll do is sort of take a step back with formative assessment, because of course formative assessment started, or no, it didn't start with, but for many people it goes back to Dylan William and the sort of black box thinking of the late 1990s, and then of course it was picked up with pedagogy into practice which was shared with schools, again, early in the millennium. And what happened in that first sort of decade of the 21st century is formative assessment became a catch-all for all sorts of activities that people were actually doing in schools. And so the problem, in a sense, with formative assessment, and so Dylan William himself has sort of stepped away a bit from some of the practices that were associated with formative assessment. The cliched one that people use is the sort of the checking for understanding, the sort of lollipop style checking for understanding, and rag rating checking of understanding, where students would give a sense of, traffic lights, this is where I am. One of the problems of that was that sometimes students can have the illusion of fluency, and they can think that because they have something in front of them, because explanation has been clear, and because they understand something, that they know something. And so, and that's not the case. One can understand something, but then forget it. So formative assessment became, I think generally formative assessment has become very complicated. I'm not saying that in your school setting, it might not still be the right language to use. For us, we wanted to, in a way, when I say hold our teachers more accountable for something, I don't mean that in a very punitive way. I mean in a sense of going back to the basics of what powerful teaching is about. And checking for understanding is just is taking it right. It's what I call Ronseal language. It does what it says on the tin. If you're not checking, if students don't understand, you shouldn't be moving forward with the learning. Now, formative assessment is more flowery language in a sense. It isn't as straightforward as just saying, do the students understand? And what's fascinating is if you think about the things that students complain about if teaching and learning are not going as they should, understanding and I don't understand this is the first thing that they're likely, apart from behavior, the first thing they're likely to have a problem with. So we wanted to make it simple. If you look at formative assessment, it could be all sorts of things. It could be to do with, for example, peer assessment and the way students are talking about their learning. So formative assessment has become a sort of a catch-all for a number of assessment strategies. And we, in our context, wanted to make it more straightforward and say, do you know what? Just check they understand. And just think about how you're checking they understand and when you're checking that they understand. And more importantly, that 100% of them understand, because that's the important bit. We found before lockdown that students hide in their learning. And part of powerful teaching is to make sure no student can hide from you. And the current scenarios from the front teaching, video lessons, remote learning, make it easier for students to hide. And powerful teaching does not let a student hide. And what's interesting is students rarely hide through bad behavior, because bad behavior is very visible. The sort of hiding that happens is those passive behaviors, and those students who absolutely know how to keep their head down, or who absolutely know how to do the minimum, or to coast, or to avoid. And therefore checking for understanding seemed a way of challenging that formative assessment didn't. But that's a language thing. So honestly, if somebody feels that formative assessment works better for them, the other reason I think for us was that the whole lesson should be formative. So everything you're doing in a lesson, in a way, should be formative. When you're explaining and modelling, it should be formative, because you are taking impressions of what's going on. And that was what Dylan William wanted to, Dylan William has said, I should have called it responsive teaching. And so some of the books that have been written more recently have talked about responsive teaching, because it is that sense that you're teaching again, should not be, I plan my lesson in one place, I deliver it, then I mark the books a week later. It should be a far more organic and responsive activity. Does that help to give a sense?
It does, yes. Many thank you for that. Yes.
Thank you ever so much, Ruth, and I love that. Powerful teachers do not accept that anybody can hide. I think that that's a great statement. I'm now opening up to anybody who wants to wave at me, either through a medium of electronic, or just as David's done, which is my favourite medium of sort of the hand, as it were, because I don't know how to do the electronic bit. So David, a question for Ruth? Do you want to unmute?
Hi, Ruth. That was absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed the presentation. It was really lots of things to take away and think about, etc. So I just wanted to, one of the ones was actually about that formative assessment aspect, because I noticed on one of the slides there you had sort of the checking for understanding, and you had mini whiteboards in there. So I'm a real advocate of using mini whiteboards, and I'd sort of say that that's a, you know, people would probably categorize that as a form of formative assessment there. Obviously also questioning as well is like a form of formative assessment, and I really like the language that you used, which is sort of checking for understanding. And we've at Pasmos, where I am, we've got various sort of groups that we're doing, and I'm going to be leading a group of staff to do with formative assessment, and I'm now thinking of changing the entire title of that to checking for understanding, because I do think that that's really what we need to be doing at this particular point in time. I just wondered, first of all, with that point, do you know of any sort of research, because you alluded to saying things like people have been moving away from like rag rating and these lollipop sticks and peer assessment, things like that. Do you happen to know any research that sort of talks about that, and that they're not, you know, possibly the most effective way to check understanding?
Good question. And one of the things that I can therefore do in the blog is look into that and delve into that a bit more. The quick answer would be that not research, but Harry Fletcher Wood has written quite well on the whole issue of effective sort of formative assessment and checking for understanding, because he, in terms of his background, was very much, he wrote a blog, Improving Teaching, where he was trialing various methods, and he has written a couple of quite good sort of lots of examples of what's actually making choices in the classroom. So I will, in the blog, I will look to find some sort of better answers for you there in terms of the Harry Fletcher Wood element. But essentially, in terms of the pedagogy of it, it goes back to the emphasis of the importance at the minute of testing, and the fact that actually, and of course testing again traditionally has been deeply unpopular in teaching, but the problem with just asking a student whether they know something is that they might be wrong about it. So two bits of research as I'm thinking about it. One of them is by somebody called Merriam Bauer, and what Merriam Bauer looked at is, are learners always right? And the concept that sometimes learners can be wrong about what they think they prefer. So a good example is that often low attainers can really enjoy and think they're good at independent learning. And actually that may not be the case, whereas higher attainers can actually quite like scaffolded and very guided learning, and actually they might be better with more independent techniques. So Merriam Bauer's argument is that the learner doesn't always choose the best strategy for themselves. They can think they like something, and there's similar feedback on testing on that again I can share with you, that students don't necessarily like testing, but actually they can perform more effectively when they're doing it, because the whole problem of just asking a student how they feel is that if they feel comfortable, if for example they've had good explanation, and they understand something in a lesson, they may feel too confident about their learning and not actually retrieve it and reinforce it because at the time they understood it. And the really important thing there is to say, do you know what, you may have known something in a lesson, but learning has to be repeated to be learning. And if you're not repeating it, it's not learning. It would be lovely to think we could go into a classroom and teach somebody once and they'd remember it forever. But the problem with checking learning too soon is that it might have been there, but it gets forgotten. And one of the fascinating things when we're recording our learning, and we do talk about formative mark books, is that actually when our students get something wrong, how much of that is because they couldn't do it at all and never could, and how much of it is because they've forgotten something that they knew. And that capturing that information is really useful, I think, in formative assessment, because certainly for us, most of what our students get wrong, they could actually do at some point, and then they forgot it because they didn't actually practice it.
Yeah, there's lots of research, isn't there, about sort of retrieval practice, and the very art of remembering helps somebody to remember. So I think, I can't remember who's done the research. I mean, there's lots on this particular topic, but just by definition, the students preparing for an assessment or a test helps them to perform better than those who don't have some form of test. So yes, I would certainly agree with that. I just had another couple of quick questions. So at Passmore's, I think those that have been on these sort of forums in the past, we've got lots of students who are disadvantaged. So, I wanted to ask, do you have students at Wilmslow, and I came to the school last year, I was really impressed with everything, who don't have the technology and sort of don't have access to it? Because we have lots of those kids, and we're trying to sort of work out how we're going to make this fit, because I think the government's just passed some amendment to some bill to say that all schools must be delivering some sort of online sort of lessons or content of the curriculum, and we've probably got 20% of our kids who don't have the infrastructure and the kit, and actually getting that kit from the government has been really slow and really difficult.
Yeah, our context is interesting because we are the only secondary maintained secondary in the town, and so we have everything from extremely affluent families, very, very affluent, to very deprived families. So a very, very wide social composition. And because we're a big school, although our percentage of deprived students looks fairly small, actually, when you look at the ballpark numbers, it's one of the biggest in Cheshire East because we're such a big school. And we found that the lack of access to the right digital device has been crucial. So some of the things we're doing about that, we call it knowing our students better. And again, the language was deliberate there because we've been on a journey with data. And the journey with data is that sometimes teachers can not like thinking about numbers and data for students, but actually, if that's part of knowing a student's brain and potential and things about them, it's really important. One of the things that we've set ourselves to challenge of this year is it's not now enough just to know our students better in terms of themselves. We want to know everything about their digital device. So I already have what we call our progress spreadsheets, where we capture important information about students. We are capturing at the minute in a survey exactly what digital device our students are using, because we feel that to engage with them digitally, we need to make sure each one of them has the right digital device. We're fighting a battle with them about the fact that a phone is not an effective digital device, because one of the problems with it, it doesn't allow the processing necessary for that learning and building of that schemata of knowledge. And so we're thinking about using Freedom Tech, for example, where we want to operate on 3 layers. Obviously, there'll be students where they can provide themselves with a digital device. We're using Freedom Tech to support those families at the next layer. And then we will be using our catch-up premium to be supporting students with the layer under that. But what we want to do is engage them more. And I'll be really honest with you here, during lockdown, what happened for us is that we got devices and, you know, one of our site staff would take them and to deliver them to a student's home. That's not enough. It needs to be, this needs to be us working with them. It needs to be us providing training. It needs to be us integrating the use of that device. And so we're thinking of ways. Sometimes our students cannot value something because they don't see what lies behind it. So if we just deliver a device at home for them, it isn't giving the sense of where it fits. So we're designing a training program. What we're doing at the minute is actually making our students, we're doing Zoom lessons for them in school with us to tool them up, because one of the things we found is a lot of our students, and and I'll talk more about this in the session about powerful learners, our students lack digital fluency and we lack digital fluency. And therefore, they try and join Zoom. I mean, the number of times we've had students try and join Zoom and drop out, and it's about the infrastructure. Their Wi-Fi isn't good enough, for example, or other things. So we are the sort of people who never normally before knew about the technology of students. We're really, really making it our business to know that, because we think that if every student has a good device that they can engage with and know how to use. So we've been buying Chromebooks, but the feedback is our students are not really good with Chromebooks, and it isn't the most intuitive sort of device for them. And so we're wondering if we should spend a bit more to buy things with styluses, because that actually might be better to engage them with the writing aspect. So basically we're thinking more about digital fluency, because we think that a really comprehensive approach to digital fluency will actually make more of a difference, and we need to seriously tool up our students in this new thing, but do it with us, because if they don't do it with us, they then don't do it without us. So it's almost, I guess, like a fire drill. We want to go through, like, this is what a Zoom lesson will look like with you, and then make them do these things with us. Because it goes back to the fact that the minute they walk out of the door, for some of them, they think that school is doesn't exist for them anymore. And it's bringing us back into their homes again with the device and how we do that.
Thank you ever so much, David. Thank you, Ruth.
Thanks so much.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And thank you for those questions. And Ruth just alluded there to the next session on powerful learning. I think that obviously the digital aspects of that, and I like that, if they don't do it with us, will they do it without us? Jackie, thank you for patiently having your hand up. Again, I'm going to have to learn how to do that. It looks so impressive when I say little digital hand. So over to Jackie. And then for everybody who's on the call, if anybody's got any more questions, I should imagine we've got about 10 more minutes of Ruth time for that. So any questions, then please wave at me, or electronically or physically. Jackie.
Okay, I mean, there's quite a few things that came up. One thing, the most recent thing was about obviously laptops, and I totally get that. I mean, we had a situation, I actually ended up buying 20 mini laptops last week from when we had 2 year groups out, and I offered it to one family and they went no. You know, they just didn't want it. They don't want the laptop. So it is quite frustrating. I think it is, you know, trying to sort of work with families with that. So I thought that was really good. I think you might have known, Lisa, I had to pop out earlier because I had to go and explain to my year 9s what they were doing, because we haven't seen them in school for 2 weeks. So I had to pop out. So I did miss 10 minutes of it. So are we going to get a source of recording of it later or something?
There's going to be access to a recording. Ruth has very kindly offered that we could do that. And alongside that, Ruth, you mentioned obviously the PowerPoint, because that's got the links in it. And Ruth is going to be doing the blog as well. So
brilliant. Yeah. I think that's really useful. I mean, one of the things that was resonating to me when Ruth was talking about, you know, all those things you're asking teachers to do, and, you know, to think about the way they're teaching. And it's interesting because if you speak to any of the staff at our school at the moment, they'll be saying we're overworked with this or that, and it is hard at the moment. It's harder than it's ever been. We're working in bubbles, so we've got year groups in different areas of school, and it's horrific, to be honest. So teachers are moving around between lessons. But actually, when you're going around doing learning walks at the moment, I've seen some of the best teaching I've ever seen at the moment, because I think that teachers are having to bring out all the sort of ideas out of their toolkit at the moment, and it's probably, I don't know how you're finding it, Ruth, because at the moment you mentioned extra things to talk about, to think about at the moment. The teachers go, I can't cope with any more, but actually they're doing it, and how to sort of empower them really that they are doing this, and here's some more ideas really.
Yeah, I mean, what we've tried to do, and we've been doing it since lockdown started, and it goes back to the point about empowering them and I guess who you want to be as a leader at this point. And I think personally, our role as leaders at this point should be facilitators. So I'm saying to them, what do you need? How can we help? We've, with our capitation, we've had some underspend, obviously, of the things that people haven't been able to do. And we've sliced off a bit of that to have this fund to spend on, you know, let's get you webcams, let's think about iPads, let's think about, we're using something called OWL, which is a 365 camera that you can use in the classroom and can connect with people who aren't able to access the lesson. So what we're trying to do is tap into the creativity and be, you know, what I'd like to be as a leader at the minute is somebody who helps people to make it happen.
He's the lady sat on the right of me. I only popped up.
I think that is our role at the moment, and that's what I like about the fact that it's not about Ofsted, it's not about Progress 8, it's about us and our staff in our schools together, trying to do our best, or in our, you know, studies or bedrooms together, trying to do our best to get learning across to our students, whatever the circumstances. And what I like is by having that atmosphere of camaraderie and we're all in it together and let's help each other. I think our job is to try and remove barriers where we can and solve problems where we can. And that is building something very powerful in schools. So at the minute, you know, I'm trying to encourage staff, and also by being very flexible, and that's worked for us as well, because some of our, you know, back to digital fluency, we've all had to grapple with things that we don't really like, and therefore giving people the space. So some of our staff are loving the narrated PowerPoints, others are loving the live lessons. And so trying to be just supportive of people, I think, and solve their problems as much as possible and be helpful as much as possible. That's where I think we should be at the minute as school leaders. You know, so that would be my thoughts.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you ever so much. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Ruth. And I think as well, Ruth, I know that a lot of this are things that Wilmslow's been building up to, and things that will actually be important and worthwhile, you know, far and beyond this current period that we find themselves in. And again, just want to reiterate from a whole ed's perspective, it's brilliant that we've been able to bring this today and the next two masterclasses, and we do truly believe that there will be of use in the here and now, but also will have long-term impact on just good practice and good practices in the future. Christine, I believe that you had a question. I think Christine's the only question I can see on the chat. And lots of people are dropping off to school meetings at the moment. So if we make this the last one then, Christine, thank you.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, thank you very much, Ruth. It's been very interesting. You know, I just wondered from, I'm from a primary school, just when your students get older, with the work that you've been doing on this so far, have you noticed that there's a difference between the age groups as the children get older? Because we always assume that their learning becomes more sophisticated.
I think our journey has been that it's been our younger students who have struggled the most with this. And that's probably a mixture of the fact that we've put more into, if we're honest about it, we've put more into our Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 classes. And the students, I think, have been more able to access different types of learning. Their independent skills have been better. And it really has been our Year 7 and our Year 8 students who, when we've looked at the difference, it was fascinating. We actually, when we we do a sort of what we call a prag of our students. We look and sort of identify where there are concerns with them, and we did that in February just before lockdown. And generally, we don't flag up that many concerns for our Key Stage 3 students, and we were finding the difference for them was really big, and so that's why we're so keen to develop these new sort of to keep learning and keep being creative, because it was fascinating going back to students hiding. We found that for our younger students, they don't necessarily like, for example, on a live lesson, they don't necessarily like participating. There are so many other issues that they're dealing with. They don't want to necessarily see their face. They don't necessarily want to hear their voice. They worry about the other people in the room. So whether, and it's interesting as to whether the same thing will be the case in the older years of primary or not. But really that I think has been something for us, and that's why actually we've sometimes found that having big groups of students for delivery can work, or smaller groups of students, but teaching a class of 30 students using something like Zoom has just been quite something that students haven't necessarily found easy to participate in. I don't know if that resonates with your experiences.
Yeah, to be honest, we're at the early stages of remote. We're not in lockdown. We're here every day with the pupils, and we've got a couple of 5-year-olds. I think it was 4 5-year-olds that have phoned in from home today to join the class lesson. But that's the maximum number we've had at the moment. So I mean, we're still a little bit behind, fortunately, and we'll have to hit the ground running with it, very much so. But it's why it's so interesting hearing how far you've got with it. Really, you've got there really, really quickly, which is brilliant. Yeah.
Well, we built it. I mean, our journey was, of course, in March. As with everybody, school closed. We had to build slowly with staff and take our staff on a journey of live and remote. And we took them on that journey by being very flexible about it and offering lots and lots of training and lots of support and lots of opportunities to try things out. And so we took that journey in the summer. Then when we started in September, everybody was, you know, the from the front teaching we really, really focused on. And over the last few weeks, it was obvious that remote learning was coming in some way. I was saying to Lisa before, we've got 1 year group today that are at home, and we've got 2 other year groups with a class at home. So we are now in the 3 scenario model, which seems like a way of the future, where most of our students are in school with the from the front teaching, but we've got significant numbers of students who aren't in school with the X code that we need to provide the remote learning from, 2 classes out where the teacher can be delivering in school to the class, and a year group out for probably 2 days, and therefore delivering those live lessons at home. And so I think that is where it's going at the minute, having teachers having to think flexibly across 2 or 3 scenarios like that in any week, and have models that will work in that way. So we're using the word nimble, you know, the ability to be very nimble, very flexible, very responsive, and think about your tech, you know, think about webcams, etc. What's lovely is because we haven't pushed our staff and we've tried to let them experiment, they're actually ploughing ahead and saying, we want this, we want that, we want the other. We've just discovered, is it Pear Duck? And somebody said, oh, Pear Duck is really good for sort of checking for understanding. And so because we haven't forced it on people, they are finding their own way. And then our job is to give them the tech that they need to achieve it. So my inbox is full of about 3 people saying, you know, we need more webcams and we need iPads and we need, but we have got that use of the capitation. We haven't spent any more on it, but we've just stripped something back and thought, well, do you know what, by doing this, we can make that spend And again, people get excited about that. We were able to buy some more iPads for the maths team, and they got very enthusiastic then about what they could do with them. So yeah, that certainly we are wishing to put catch-up spend into that IT that just facilitates teachers to be getting excited about this, because I think my thinking is, if you've got exhausted, demotivated, run-down teachers, that is not going to be powerful teaching for the students. Whereas if you've got excited, energized, creative teachers, but we've deliberately talked about a lot of collaborative. We've stripped back all of our meetings. We don't have any meetings at the minute, apart from collaborative team planning for people to be planning resources, because we want all of our staff's energy to go on producing high quality resources. And we've tried to be, again, to focus on a particular teacher taking ownership of a year group, etc. So we're not overstretching people, and they can focus on high quality everywhere. Because again, back to Key Stage 3, our Key Stage 3 arguably lost out a bit to Key Stage 4 and 5. So we need to make sure the quality is there as we go through this year.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Christine,
Thank you.
and thank you ever so much, Ruth. You can see that, as is the way with the world, lots of people are have had to go off to meetings, but they've passed on their thanks. And I think a lot of schools are echoing that about keeping the main thing. So teachers who are looking at the quality of teaching and what they're teaching, and little else at this present moment. So hopefully that will echo with lots of people and what lots of people in the room are doing. Once again, a huge thank you to you, Ruth. The next session is next Tuesday at 8 AM. We've tried to look at an afternoon session, an after school session, and a breakfast session, simply to get your feedback on what works, because it looks like this virtual world is here for a little while longer. We will appreciate any feedback on that. Any feedback for Ruth today, or any things that you're looking forward to in the next session, let us know. In the next session as well, there will be Hannah Wilson after Ruth, just for a very short while, talking about the mental health offer and the diversity, equity and inclusion. That's for both primary and secondary. If you've got any members of your community, so any other schools in the community who, having listened to this today, you think, God, I think they'd really appreciate listening to Ruth or joining in with the whole ed offer, then please do let us know. The more the merrier. And it's been wonderful to see you, those who've actually come onto the screen, to actually see your faces. Those who haven't, I know that you're there behind the screens, and thank you very much for joining us, and have a very, very pleasant rest of the week. Our thoughts are with you. We know it's super tough at the moment. If there's anything we can do at then let us know, and we'll try our best to help you.